The crystal wine glass in my hand trembled slightly as I stared across our mahogany dining table at my stepmother Victoria. The perfectly cooked salmon on my plate suddenly tasted like a cardboard. "You did what?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Victoria dabbed at her lips with a linen napkin, her red lipstick leaving a perfect mark. "Really, Charlotte, don't be dramatic. La Maison was dragging down the family's portfolio. I found buyers who'll probably turn it into one of those trendy fusion places." She waved her hand dismissively. "They're paying well above market value." My name is Charlotte Durant, and at 28, I was watching my stepmother of 3 years casually destroy my mother's legacy. La Maison wasn't just a restaurant, it was my childhood, my heritage, and the last real connection I had to my mother who had passed away 5 years ago. "Dad," I turned to my father, who was suddenly very interested in cutting his salmon into increasingly smaller pieces. "You can't let her do this. Mom built that restaurant from nothing. It's been in our family for 30 years. The decision's made, Charlie," he said softly, still not meeting my eyes. "Victoria's right. The restaurant's profits have been declining. Sometimes we have to make hard business decisions." I felt the familiar anger rise in my chest. Ever since he'd married Victoria, my father had become a shadow of himself, deferring to her on everything from family holidays to business decisions. The successful restaurateur who had supported my mother's dreams was gone, replaced by a man who seemed afraid of his own wife. "Hard business decisions," I repeated, "like selling a property you don't even own." La Maison was left to me in Mom's will. Victoria's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose slightly. "Actually, dear, your father maintained controlling interest as executor of the estate until you turned 30. We're well within our rights to sell." I set down my wine glass carefully, afraid I might shatter it in my grip. She was right. My mother's will had stipulated that my father would manage the restaurant until I turned 30, thinking he would protect it, nurture it, keep it running until I was ready to take over completely. What my mother hadn't anticipated was Victoria Torres, the glamorous real estate agent who had swept into our lives 3 years after her death, bringing with her an aggressive approach to modernizing our family's assets. "When?" I asked, proud of how steady my voice remained. "The new owners take possession next Friday," Victoria replied, taking a delicate sip of her wine. "They're paying cash, so the closing is expedited. I'll need you to handle the staff notifications and inventory clearance." Of course she would. Victoria always managed to delegate the unpleasant tasks to me, all while maintaining her image as the efficient, business-savvy stepmother who was just looking out for the family's interests. I pushed back my chair and stood up. "If you'll excuse me, I've lost my appetite." "Charlotte." My father finally looked up, his face lined with guilt. "Try to understand. The restaurant, it's not what it used to be. Your mother wouldn't want you tied to a failing business." I stared at him, remembering all the nights he and Mom had spent planning menus, selecting wines, building La Maison into one of the most respected French restaurants in Boston. How quickly he'd forgotten. "No," I said quietly. "Mom wouldn't want me to give up without a fight." I walked out of the dining room, Victoria's voice floating after me. "Really, Charles, I don't know why she's being so difficult about this. It's just a restaurant." Just a restaurant. As if La Maison could be reduced to mere brick and mortar, to profit margins and market value. She had no idea what that place really meant, what secrets it held. I drove through the rain-slicked streets of Boston to La Maison, using my key to enter through the kitchen door. The restaurant was closed on Mondays, and the familiar space was dark and quiet. I moved through the kitchen, running my hand along the stainless steel counters where I'd learned to cook at my mother's side. The main dining room was bathed in soft light from the street lamps outside, illuminating the hand-painted murals my mother had commissioned, scenes of the French countryside where she'd grown up. Each table was still perfectly set, white tablecloths gleaming, wine glasses sparkling. Victoria might see a failing business, but I saw decades of memories, of passion, of love. I made my way to the wine cellar door, hidden behind a vintage French poster. The heavy wooden door creaked slightly as I opened it, the temperature dropping as I descended the stone steps. This was where my mother had worked her real magic. The main wine cellar was impressive enough. Hundreds of bottles carefully cataloged and stored at perfect temperature. But it was the secret room behind the false wall that held La Maison's true treasure. My mother had started collecting rare wines in her 20s, long before she met my father. Over the years, she had amassed a collection that would make wine connoisseurs weep. I pressed the hidden latch and the false wall swung open silently. The room beyond was smaller, but every bottle here was worth more than most people made in a year. Chateau Lafayette Rothschild, 1869. Roman et Conti, 1945. Chateau Latour, 1961. My mother had collected them all. The entire collection was worth millions, but its existence was known only to me and Jean Luc, our ancient sommelier who had worked with my mother for decades. We had kept it secret, protected it, waiting for the right moment to reveal its true value. That moment, it seemed, had arrived sooner than expected. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I'd memorized but never used. After 3 rings, a familiar French-accented voice answered. "Ah, Charlotte, I was wondering when you would call." "Marcus," I said, "I need your help. It's time to make good on that promise you made to my mother." Marcus Durant had been my mother's mentor in her early days as a wine collector. Now he was one of the most respected wine authenticators in the world. "The collection?" he asked. "Is it at risk?" "Victoria's selling the restaurant. We have less than a week." He was quiet for a moment. "I can be there tomorrow morning. Have Jean-Luc prepare the documentation." After hanging up, I sent a text to Jean-Luc. "It's happening. Meet me at the restaurant tomorrow at 8 a.m. Then I sat down on the cool stone floor, surrounded by millions of dollars worth of wine, and finally let myself cry. Not just for the restaurant, but for my mother, for the legacy she'd built, for the father who seemed to have forgotten what any of it meant. My phone buzzed. A text from my best friend and La Maison's head chef. "Sophie, just heard from the staff. That witch is really selling us out." "Not if I can help it," I replied. "Meeting tomorrow at 8 a.m. We're activating Plan B." Sophie and I had been preparing for something like this ever since Victoria had started making noise about streamlining the family's assets. We had backups of all the restaurant's records, copies of my mother's original recipes, and most importantly, a list of loyal customers who would be very interested to learn about Victoria's plans. I stood up, brushing off my pants and taking one last look at the hidden wine room. My mother had always said that timing was everything, in cooking, in wine, in life. Victoria thought she was selling a failing restaurant. She had no idea she was about to uncork a vintage scandal. The next morning, La Maison's kitchen was alive with tension. Sophie stood at her usual place by the stove, but instead of preparing for service, she was reviewing documents with Jean-Luc. Marcus had arrived from New York, his expert's eye already gleaming at the prospect of examining the collection. "The documentation is perfect," Jean-Luc said, his weathered hands smoothing out the papers on the steel prep table. "Your mother kept records of every purchase, every authentication. The provenance is undeniable." Marcus nodded, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "And you've maintained perfect temperature control. The humidity levels." "Exactly as Madame Durant specified," Jean-Luc replied. "For 25 years, I have not deviated from her instructions by even 1 degree. "Then let's see them," Marcus said. I led the small group down to the cellar, watching their faces as I revealed the hidden room. Even Sophie, who had known about its existence, gasped at the sight of so many legendary wines in one place. Marcus moved through the collection with reverence, examining bottles, checking labels, making notes. After an hour, he turned to me with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Charlotte, this is extraordinary. The 1869 Lafayette alone would fetch over $230,000 at auction. The entire collection." He paused, making some quick calculations. "Conservatively, we're looking at $8 to $10 million. Sophie whistled softly. "No wonder your mother kept this secret." "And the buyers Victoria found," I said. "They have no idea this exists." "Impossible," Jean-Luc scoffed. "The false wall does not appear in any building plans. Only those Madame trusted knew of its existence." I smiled grimly. "Perfect. Sophie, is everyone here?" She nodded. "The whole staff is waiting upstairs. They're scared, Charlotte. This place is their home too." We gathered in the main dining room. The servers, line cooks, dishwashers, everyone who had helped make La Maison special. Many had worked here for decades, hired by my mother when the restaurant was just starting out. "I know you're worried," I began, looking at their familiar faces. "But I promise you, La Maison isn't going anywhere. Victoria thinks she's selling a struggling restaurant. What she doesn't know is that we're about to make her an offer she can't legally refuse. I explained the plan, watching hope replace fear in their eyes. By the time I finished, there was a new energy in the room, a sense of purpose. "What do you need us to do?" Maria, our longest-serving server, asked. "For now, business as usual, but be ready. When this breaks, it's going to get complicated." The next few days were a blur of preparation. Marcus worked with an art security firm to document and value every bottle. Jean-Luc compiled years of temperature and humidity logs. Sophie coordinated with our suppliers and regular customers, ensuring everyone was prepared for what was coming. The night before the sale was set to close, I sat in my mother's old office, looking at her photograph on the wall. She was standing in front of La Maison on opening night, young and beautiful and full of dreams. My phone buzzed. Victoria calling for the third time that day. I let it go to voicemail, already knowing what she wanted. She'd been trying to get me to sign some last-minute paperwork, probably trying to legally protect herself. The next morning, I arrived at the restaurant early. Victoria was already there with the buyers, a pair of sleek entrepreneurs in expensive suits who looked like they'd never worked in a kitchen in their lives. "Charlotte," Victoria said with fake warmth. "Good you're here. We just need your signature on a few things before we finish up." I smiled, setting my briefcase on one of the dining tables. "Actually, I have something you all need to see first." The buyers looked confused as Marcus and Jean-Luc entered, carrying stacks of documentation. Victoria's smile faltered slightly. "What's this about?" "We have a closing scheduled." "Yes," I cut her off. "About that. Did you disclose the wine cellar in the sale documents?" She waved dismissively. "Of course. The wine inventory is included." "Not that wine cellar," I said quietly. "The other one." The color drained from her face as I led everyone downstairs. The buyers' expressions changed from annoyance to amazement as the hidden room was revealed. Marcus began his presentation, discussing the value and rarity of each bottle. "This collection," he concluded, "represents one of the finest private wine collections in the world. Its total value exceeds $9 million. Victoria's perfectly manicured hands were shaking. "This is ridiculous." Charles never mentioned. "Because he didn't know," I said. "Mom kept this separate from the family assets. It belongs solely to me, as specified in a separate trust document." I pulled out the paperwork my mother's lawyer had helped me locate. "If you sell La Maison, you're also liable for the value of this collection, which was never included in the sale price." The buyers were already backing away, realizing the deal was about to get much more complicated. Victoria's face had turned an interesting shade of red. "You planned this," she hissed. "You let me arrange this sale knowing you had no right to sell my mother's restaurant in the first place?" I finished. "Yes, I did. Just like you planned to sell this place out from under me before I turned 30. My father chose that moment to appear at the cellar entrance, his face a mix of shock and something else. Was it pride? "Charlie," he said softly, "the collection, your mother never told me." "She wanted to protect it," I replied. "She wanted to make sure I would always have a choice about my future, that I couldn't be forced to give up her dream." Victoria turned to him, ready to launch into one of her manipulative speeches, but he held up his hand. "No, Victoria. Enough." He looked around the cellar, then at me, really seeing me for the first time in years. "This sale is off. La Maison stays in the family, just like Catherine wanted." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of change. Victoria moved out, unable to face the embarrassment of her failed scheme. My father, as if waking from a long sleep, began spending time at the restaurant again, rekindling his love for the business he and my mother had built together. La Maison's wine collection, now properly valued and insured, became the talk of the culinary world. Wine enthusiasts and collectors began making reservations months in advance, hoping to sample rare vintages that we carefully released from the collection. One evening, as I sat at the bar after closing, Sophie brought out a bottle from the secret cellar, a 1982 Bordeaux that had been my mother's favorite. "Your mom would be proud," she said, pouring 2 glasses, "not just of saving the restaurant, but of how you did it. You protected her legacy while creating your own." I took a sip, letting the complex flavors remind me of all the wine tastings my mother had hosted, all the knowledge she'd passed down. "You know what's funny?" I said. Victoria thought she was so clever, trying to sell a failing restaurant. She never understood that the real value of this place isn't in the building or even in the wine. It's in the memories, the passion, the love that goes into every meal and every bottle we serve. My father joined us, looking more like his old self than he had in years. Your mother used to say that a great restaurant was like a great wine. It gets better with age, but only if you respect its history while allowing it to evolve. He raised his glass. To Catherine, who knew exactly what she was doing when she created that secret cellar. And to you, Charlie, for being every bit as clever and determined as she was. As we toasted, I looked around at the restaurant, at the staff cleaning up, at the paintings on the walls, at the warmth and character that no trendy fusion place could ever replicate. Victoria had tried to reduce it all to numbers on a spreadsheet, but she had failed to understand the most important lesson my mother ever taught me. Some things are worth more than money. Some things can't be bought or sold. Some things, like love and legacy and the perfect glass of wine, only grow more valuable with time. La Maison didn't just survive, it thrived. We maintained our traditional French cuisine while carefully innovating, just as my mother would have wanted. The secret wine cellar became a legend in culinary circles, with select bottles occasionally offered for truly special occasions. Victoria, I heard, had moved to Miami and was trying to rebuild her real estate career. My father found his passion for the restaurant business again, mentoring young chefs and sharing stories about the early days with Mom. And me, I stood at the helm of La Maison, honoring my mother's legacy while creating my own. Every night, as I walked through the dining room, greeting guests and suggesting wine pairings, I felt her presence, not as a ghost, but as an inspiration. Because in the end, she had given me more than a restaurant or a priceless wine collection. She had given me the tools to fight for what mattered, the wisdom to wait for the right moment, and the confidence to know that sometimes the best revenge is simply proving them wrong.